The biting wind stung Grace Gibson's face as she struggled through knee-deep snow, her arms laden with firewood that seemed to grow heavier with each labored step. February 1881 had brought the harshest winter truth or consequences New Mexico had seen in decades, and at 22, Grace had never felt more alone in her battle against the unforgiving elements. "Miss, you'll freeze before you make it halfway home with that load," a deep voice called from behind her. Grace turned, nearly losing her footing in the process. Through the swirling snow, she made out the tall figure of a man on horseback, his face partially obscured by a worn leather hat pulled low against the wind. As he dismounted in one fluid motion, she clutched the firewood tighter to her chest, wary of strangers after 2 years of fending for herself. "Let me do this," he said, reaching for the bundle. His voice was gentle but firm, like he wasn't accustomed to being refused. When she hesitated, he added, "Madam, those hands of yours are turning the same color as this snow. I'm just offering help." "I don't know you," Grace replied, her breath forming clouds between them. "Yates Quinn," he answered simply, tipping his hat. "New to these parts, and you're freezing." Grace studied him for a moment. His eyes were kind beneath the shadow of his hat brim, and something about his steady gaze made her release her grip on the firewood. "Grace Gibson," she responded as he effortlessly took the heavy load. "I live just beyond that ridge, my father's cabin." Yates nodded, leading his horse with one hand while balancing the firewood with the other. "Nasty day to be out hauling wood." "Nasty day or not, the fire doesn't feed itself," Grace said, flexing her numb fingers. "Fair point," he agreed. "You live at the old McAllister place," Grace nodded. "My father bought it 2 years ago, died last spring of pneumonia." She hadn't meant to reveal so much to a stranger, but something about Yates Quinn made the words tumble out before she could stop them. Perhaps it was the simple loneliness of mountain life, or perhaps it was the way he listened without interrupting. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and she believed he meant it. "You've been managing the place alone." "I manage just fine," Grace answered, lifting her chin against the implication that she might not be capable. Yates smiled then, a warm expression that transformed his weather-beaten face. "I don't doubt it for a moment, Miss Gibson. Still, everyone needs a hand now and again." They trudged through the snow in companionable silence until the cabin came into view. It was a modest structure, but Grace had maintained it well, sturdy logs chinked with mud and straw, a stone chimney reaching skyward, though currently no smoke rose from it. "Fire's gone out," she said, picking up her pace. "I shouldn't have waited so long to get more wood." Inside, the cabin was neat but bare of comforts. Yates set the firewood beside the cold hearth while Grace quickly arranged kindling. Her fingers trembled with cold as she struck a match. "Allow me," Yates said, kneeling beside her. His hands were steady as he took over the task, carefully building the fire until flames licked upward, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. "You're good at that," Grace observed. "Spent many nights on the trail." Fire-making becomes second nature. Yates removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30 at most. "You're a cowboy then?" she asked, extending her hands toward the growing warmth. "Cattle driver was anyway, looking to settle down now. Bought the old Fletcher ranch last month." Grace looked at him with new interest. "The Fletcher place, that's been empty for years, it's a good piece of land." "Needs work," Yates admitted, "but it has potential." He glanced around the cabin. Like this place. For the first time in months, Grace felt a spark of something besides determination to simply survive. It might have been hope, or perhaps just the pleasure of conversation with someone who didn't look at her with pity, as the townspeople often did the poor Gibson girl, alone in her father's cabin. "Would you care for some coffee?" she offered, surprising herself. "Least I can do to thank you for the help with the wood." Yates's smile returned. "That would be mighty welcome, Miss Gibson." As Grace busied herself with the coffee pot, she was acutely aware of his presence, solid and reassuring in her small home. She hadn't invited anyone inside since her father's passing, and yet it felt strangely right to have Yates Quinn warming himself by her fire. "How far is your ranch from here?" she asked as she set the pot in the coals. "About 5 miles southwest." Not far as the crow flies, but the terrain makes it seem farther. I know the place, Grace nodded. There's good grazing land in the valley. You know ranching, my father taught me. We had a small spread in Colorado before coming here. She didn't add that they'd lost everything in a devastating fire, forcing them to start over in New Mexico with what little they could salvage. Yates seemed to sense the unspoken part of her story. Starting fresh is never easy. No, Grace agreed softly, but necessary sometimes. When the coffee was ready, they sat in companionable silence, the hot liquid warming them from within as the fire worked its magic on the chilled cabin. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, Grace felt something melting the protective ice she'd built around her heart since burying her father. I should be going, Yates said eventually, setting down his empty cup. Got stock to feed before nightfall. Of course, Grace replied, walking him to the door. Thank you again for the help. Yates paused, one hand on the door latch. Miss Gibson, I don't mean to overstep, but if you need more firewood or anything else, I'm just over that ridge. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Quinn, but as I said, you manage just fine, he finished with a small smile. All the same, neighbors should look out for one another. Grace watched from the doorway as he mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure gradually disappearing into the swirling white. She remained there long after he'd gone, the cold air on her face a counterpoint to the strange warmth blooming in her chest. 3 days later, Grace woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood. She reached for her father's old rifle before cautiously approaching the window. Through the frost-etched glass, she made out Yates's tall form, methodically working his way through a pile of logs he must have brought with him. She quickly dressed and stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight against the morning chill. Mr. Quinn, what are you doing? Yates paused mid-swing. Good morning, Miss Gibson. Thought you might need a proper woodpile before the next storm hits. He gestured to the sky, where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. I didn't ask for your help, Grace said, though there was less conviction in her voice than she'd intended. No, you didn't, Yates acknowledged, resuming his work. Consider it neighborly concern. Grace watched him for a moment, torn between pride and practicality. The truth was, chopping enough wood to last through a storm was backbreaking work, and she'd been rationing her supply, often going to bed cold rather than depleting her meager stockpile. At least come in for breakfast when you're done, she finally offered. I've got biscuits in the oven. Yates's face brightened. Now that's an offer I won't refuse. Over breakfast, Grace learned that Yates had spent the past decade driving cattle from Texas to railheads in Kansas, saving every penny toward his dream of owning land. He spoke of nights under star-filled skies, of stampedes and river crossings, of the camaraderie among men who faced danger together. Why truth or consequences? Grace asked. It's hardly on the main cattle trails. I passed through here once years back, Yates explained. Something about the mountains against the sky felt right. When I heard the Fletcher place was for sale, it seemed like fate. And now you're planning to raise cattle, horses maybe. The land will tell me what it's best suited for. He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. What about you, Miss Gibson? What are your plans for this place? The question caught Grace off guard. Since her father's death, she'd been focused solely on survival, on making it through each day. The future had seemed a luxury she couldn't afford to contemplate. I haven't thought much beyond keeping a roof over my head, she admitted. Your father left you the deed. Yes, it's mine free and clear, but a woman alone. She trailed off, not needing to explain the difficulties she faced. In the territories, a woman without family was vulnerable in countless ways. You could sell, Yates suggested gently. Start fresh somewhere easier. This is all I have left of him, Grace said simply. I won't give it up. Yates nodded, respect evident in his expression. Then you'll make it work, and neighbors help neighbors in these parts. By midday, Yates had stacked enough firewood to last Grace through several storms. As predicted, the sky had darkened ominously, and fat snowflakes were beginning to fall as he prepared to leave. You should stay, Grace said impulsively, glancing at the deteriorating weather. At least until the storm passes. It's not safe to ride in this. Yates hesitated, looking from Grace to the threatening sky. I don't want to impose. "It's not an imposition if it's an invitation," she replied. "And I'd feel responsible if something happened to you on your way home." That night, as the blizzard howled around the cabin, Grace and Yates sat before the fire, talking as if they'd known each other for years rather than days. She told him about growing up in Colorado, about her mother's death when she was 12, about learning ranching at her father's side. "He always said I had good horse sense," Grace smiled at the memory. "Taught me everything he knew, said there was no reason a daughter couldn't learn what a son would." "He sounds like a wise man," Yates commented. "He was," Grace agreed, her voice softening, "but stubborn, wouldn't see a doctor until it was too late, said he just had a winter cough. By the time I got him to town." She swallowed hard. Yates reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers briefly. "I'm sorry, Grace." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about the way it sounded in his deep voice made her heart skip. She quickly stood to check the stew bubbling over the fire, needing a moment to compose herself. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them together in the small cabin. They established an easy rhythm, Yates tending the fire and helping with the heavier chores, Grace cooking and mending a tear in his coat. They shared stories and silences, gradually filling in the contours of each other's lives. On the morning of the third day, they woke to blinding sunshine reflecting off pristine snow. The world outside was transformed, beautiful but treacherous with drifts that reached the windowsills in places. "I should check on my stock," Yates said, pulling on his boots. Grace nodded, suddenly aware of how quickly she'd grown accustomed to his presence. The cabin would seem emptier without him. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Gibson," Yates said formally as he prepared to leave, as if acknowledging that they needed to reset the boundaries that had blurred during their enforced companionship. "Grace," she corrected him softly. "After sharing a cabin for 2 days, I think we can dispense with formalities." His smile warmed his eyes. "Grace, then, and I'm Yates. Safe travels, Yates, and thank you for the firewood." He tipped his hat, a gesture she was coming to find endearing. "Anytime." As February gave way to March, Yates became a regular visitor at Grace's cabin. Sometimes he brought supplies from town, sugar or coffee that saved her the difficult journey. Other times he simply stopped by to check on her or help with repairs to the roof or corral. Grace found herself looking forward to his visits, planning her days around the possibility of seeing him. One mild afternoon in late March, Yates arrived with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began as they walked together toward the small creek that ran behind her property, "and I have a business proposition for you." "A business proposition?" Grace repeated, curious. "I've got more land than I can manage alone, and you've got more experience with cattle than I do." Yates picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the rushing water. "What if we pooled our resources? You could bring your knowledge, I could provide the capital. We could build something together." Grace stopped walking, stunned by the suggestion. "Are you offering me a job, a partnership?" Yates clarified. "Equal shares in whatever we build. Your land remains yours, mine remains mine, but we work them together." "Why would you offer that to someone you barely know?" Yates turned to face her, his expression serious. "Because in the short time I've known you, Grace Gibson, I've seen your determination, your intelligence, and your skill. You know this land and what it needs. I'd be a fool not to want to work with you." Grace felt warmth rush to her cheeks at his praise. "It's an unusual arrangement." "We're in unusual country," Yates countered. "Out here, people have to find new ways to survive. What would people say? A single woman in business with a single man." "They'll talk regardless," Yates said pragmatically. "At least this way, you'd be building something for your future." Grace considered his words, seeing the practical wisdom in them. Since her father's death, she'd been surviving, not living. This could be her chance to create something meaningful again. "I'll think about it," she promised. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the coyotes' call in the distance, Grace weighed Yates's proposal carefully. There was risk involved, not just to her reputation, but to her heart. She couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward him, the way her pulse quickened when he was near. Entering into a business arrangement would mean seeing him daily, working closely together. Could she maintain a professional distance when her feelings were increasingly personal? Yet the opportunity was too promising to dismiss. With Yates's capital and her knowledge, they could build a successful operation. She'd have purpose again, beyond mere survival. By morning, she had made her decision. Yates returned the following day, clearly anxious for her answer. They sat at her kitchen table, the remains of lunch between them as Grace outlined her thoughts. "I accept your proposal," she said, "but with conditions." Yates leaned forward, intrigued. "Name them." "Everything in writing, clear boundaries about decision-making. And we maintain separate residences." This last point was non-negotiable. Her reputation was one of the few things she had left. "Agreed on all counts," Yates said without hesitation. "We'll draw up papers in town next week. I know a fair attorney." "There's one more thing," Grace added. "I want to understand why you're really doing this. There must be easier ways to expand your operation than taking on a partner." Yates was quiet for a moment, his eyes studying her face. "You're right, there are. But none that would bring me the satisfaction of working with someone whose company I genuinely enjoy." The honesty of his answer disarmed her. "That's not a very businesslike reason." "No," he agreed with a small smile. "I suppose it isn't." In early April, they rode into town together to finalize their agreement. Truth or Consequences was a modest settlement, but it served as a supply hub for the surrounding ranches and farms. Grace was acutely aware of the curious glances cast their way as they made their way to the attorney's office. "Told you they'd talk," Yates murmured as they passed a group of women who barely bothered to hide their whispers. "Let them," Grace replied with more confidence than she felt. The attorney, a Mr. Harold Baker, was professional and efficient, drawing up a partnership agreement that protected both their interests. When the paperwork was complete, Yates suggested lunch at the town's only restaurant. "To celebrate our new venture," he explained. The restaurant was crowded with the midday rush ranch hands, shopkeepers, and the occasional family. Grace felt conspicuous as Yates held her chair, the gesture drawing more than a few interested looks. "Miss Gibson, what a pleasant surprise." The voice belonged to Olivia Thompson, the mayor's wife and self-appointed arbiter of propriety in Truth or Consequences. "We so rarely see you in town these days." "Mrs. Thompson," Grace acknowledged with a polite nod. "I've been busy with the homestead." "So I see." Olivia's gaze shifted pointedly to Yates. "And who might your friend be?" "Yates Quinn, madam," he introduced himself, standing to offer a small bow. "I purchased the Fletcher Ranch. Indeed, how interesting." Olivia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "And you and Miss Gibson are?" "Business partners," Grace interjected quickly. "Mr. Quinn and I have formalized an arrangement to combine our ranching operations." Olivia's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "How progressive of you both. Well, I mustn't keep you from your meal. Do give my regards to the Reverend on Sunday, won't you? We've missed you at services." After she departed, Yates gave Grace an apologetic look. "I didn't consider how this might complicate things for you socially." "Don't worry about Olivia Thompson," Grace said, though her stomach knotted at the thought of becoming the subject of town gossip. "She's always looking for something to disapprove of. Still, perhaps we should be more careful about appearances." Grace appreciated his concern, but refused to let small-town sensibilities dictate her choices. "We've done nothing wrong, Yates. We're entering into a legitimate business arrangement. If people choose to see something improper in that, it's their problem, not ours." Yates's expression softened with admiration. "You're quite something, Grace Gibson." As spring blossomed across the New Mexico landscape, Grace and Yates threw themselves into their partnership. They purchased a modest herd of cattle to start, focusing on quality breeding stock that would form the foundation of their operation. Yates hired 2 experienced ranch hands to help with the daily work, and together, they began the labor-intensive process of improving both properties. Grace found herself flourishing under the new arrangement. For the first time since her father's death, she was looking toward the future with hope rather than dread. Working alongside Yates was both a joy and a torment. She relished their collaboration. The way their different perspectives often led to better solutions than either would have devised alone. But she also found it increasingly difficult to ignore her growing feelings for him. He was unfailingly respectful, careful never to cross the boundaries they had established, yet there were moments when she caught him watching her with an expression that made her wonder if his interest might extend beyond their business partnership. One evening in late May, they worked late mending fences on the boundary between their properties. The sunset painted the western sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple as they drove the last post into place. "That should hold through the summer," Yates said with satisfaction. Wiping sweat from his brow, Grace nodded, suddenly aware of how alone they were, silhouetted against the dramatic sky. The ranch hands had returned to the bunkhouse hours ago, and the stillness of the approaching evening wrapped around them like a blanket. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Yates murmured, gazing at the horizon. "Yes," Grace agreed, though she found herself looking at him rather than the sunset, the strong line of his jaw, the way the golden light caught in his dark hair. He turned, catching her gaze, and something electric passed between them. For a heartbeat, Grace thought he might step closer, might breach the careful distance they'd maintained. She wasn't sure if she wanted him to or feared it. The moment broke when a distant coyote howled, startling them both back to awareness of time and place. "I should get you home before dark," Yates said, his voice slightly rough. The ride back to Grace's cabin was quiet, filled with unspoken tension. At her door, Yates lingered, seeming reluctant to leave. "Grace," he began, then hesitated. "Yes," her heart raced with anticipation. "There's a social at the church next Saturday. Would you? That is, I thought perhaps we might attend, together." The invitation caught her off guard. As business partners, a flicker of something like disappointment crossed Yates's face, "If that's how you'd prefer to frame it." Grace realized with sudden clarity that he was giving her an opening, a chance to acknowledge the changing nature of their relationship without risking outright rejection. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would enjoy attending the social with you, Yates, as friends." It was a small concession, but his smile told her it was enough for now. "Friends, then, I'll call for you at 6. The week before the social passed in a blur of anticipation. Grace found herself fretting over what to wear, a concern that would have seemed frivolous just months ago when survival was her only priority. She finally settled on her best dress, a modest blue cotton that her father had insisted she pack when they left Colorado, for special occasions. When Yates arrived to escort her to the social, his appreciative gaze made her glad she'd taken the time to arrange her auburn hair in soft curls around her face. "You look beautiful, Grace," he said simply. "Thank you." She fought a blush as she accepted his arm. "You clean up rather well yourself." The church social was held in the community hall adjacent to the small white chapel. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over tables laden with food brought by the townspeople. A small band played lively tunes in one corner, and several couples were already dancing. Their entrance caused a brief lull in conversation, confirming Grace's suspicion that they had indeed become a topic of local interest. But Yates seemed unconcerned by the attention, guiding her confidently through the crowd, greeting acquaintances with easy charm. "Miss Gibson, how lovely to see you," Reverend Miller welcomed them. "And Mr. Quinn, I understand congratulations are in order on your new business venture." "Thank you, Reverend," Yates replied. "We're optimistic about the future. As you should be, the Lord smiles on honest work and good partnerships." The Reverend's kind eyes moved between them. "Will we be seeing more of you at services now, Miss Gibson?" "I hope to attend more regularly," Grace promised, feeling a twinge of guilt for her absence since her father's death. The church had been a source of comfort once, but grief had kept her away. As the evening progressed, Grace gradually relaxed, buoyed by Yates's steadying presence and the genuine welcome of many community members. They shared a meal, conversed with neighbors, and eventually, Yates led her to the dance floor. "I should warn you," Grace said as his hand settled respectfully at her waist, "I haven't danced in years." "Fortunately, it's like riding a horse," Yates assured her. "Your body remembers, and somehow it did." As they moved together to the lilting melody, Grace felt a forgotten joy resurface, the simple pleasure of music and movement, of connection to another person. Yates was a surprisingly graceful dancer for such a tall man, guiding her with subtle pressure from his hand at her back. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Quinn," she remarked as he expertly turned her under his arm. "A man has to have some mysteries," he replied with a wink. Later, as they walked home under a canopy of stars, Grace felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. The night air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the surrounding mountains. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," Yates said as they approached her cabin. "I hope you enjoyed yourself." "I did," Grace admitted, "more than I expected to." They reached her door, and once again Grace sensed Yates wrestling with something unsaid. This time, however, he seemed to come to a decision. "Grace," he said softly, turning to face her fully, "I need to be honest with you. My feelings for you have grown beyond friendship, beyond business partnership. I find myself thinking of you at all hours, looking forward to every moment in your company." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Though she had suspected his feelings mirrored her own, hearing them spoken aloud made them suddenly, wonderfully real. "Yates, you don't need to respond now," he interjected gently. "I understand this might come as a surprise, and the last thing I want is to make you uncomfortable or jeopardize what we've built together. I needed you to know." In the silvery moonlight, his face was earnest, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. Grace felt a surge of tenderness toward him, this strong, capable man who now laid his heart bare before her. "It's not a surprise," she said finally, gathering her courage. "I've felt it too, this connection between us, but I've been afraid." "Afraid of what?" Yates asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "Of caring for someone again, of the possibility of loss." Grace looked down at her hands. "When my father died, I thought I'd never survive the pain, the idea of opening my heart again." Yates reached out slowly, taking her hands in his. "I understand fear, Grace. I've spent most of my life keeping people at arm's length, convinced that independence meant never needing anyone. Then I met you, struggling through the snow with that bundle of firewood, too stubborn to admit you needed help, and something in me recognized something in you." Grace smiled at the memory of their first meeting, how annoyed she'd been at his presumption, how grudgingly grateful for his assistance. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Yates said, "if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly. We continue our business as planned, but we also explore these feelings, see where they might lead. People will talk even more than they already do." "Let them," Yates echoed her earlier sentiment. "What matters is what's true between us, not what others perceive." Standing there in the moonlight, her hands warm in his, Grace made another life-altering decision. "I would like that, Yates, very much." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a promise, a beginning. "Good night, Grace Gibson," he murmured. "I'll see you tomorrow." As spring melted into summer, Yates courted Grace with a patience and thoughtfulness that deepened her affection for him. Their business flourished alongside their personal relationship. The cattle herd grew healthier under their combined care, and word spread about the quality of their stock. Yates was true to his word about maintaining propriety. They were never alone in her cabin after dark, and he was careful to keep their business dealings transparent to avoid any hint of impropriety. Yet within these boundaries, their connection deepened day by day. They shared books and ideas, debated cattle breeding strategies, and discovered a mutual love of music. When Yates revealed he could play the harmonica on warm evenings, they often sat on Grace's porch, watching the sunset while Yates played old trail songs. Sometimes Grace would sing along in her clear soprano, surprising herself with the joy she found in music again. One such evening in July, as fireflies began to blink in the gathering darkness, Yates set aside his harmonica with unusual solemnity. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone making Grace's heart quicken, "about the future." "What about it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Our arrangement has worked well these past months. The partnership, both professional and personal, has been more rewarding than I ever imagined possible." Yates turned to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "But I find myself wanting more, Grace." "More," she echoed, hardly daring to hope he meant what she thought he did. A life together, a true partnership in every sense. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. From the pouch, he produced a ring, a delicate gold band set with a modest diamond that caught the last rays of sunlight. It was my mother's, Yates explained softly. She made me promise I'd only give it to someone who made me feel the way my father made her feel, like home wasn't a place, but a person. Grace's eyes filled with tears as the meaning of his words sank in. Yates, Grace Gibson, I love you. Your strength, your determination, your gentle heart beneath that stubborn exterior. He smiled at her surprised laugh. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? For a moment, Grace couldn't speak past the emotion constricting her throat. She thought of the lonely months after her father's death, how she'd been merely existing, and how Yates had brought color and purpose back into her world. How his steady presence had healed something broken inside her. Yes, she whispered, then more firmly, yes, Yates Quinn, I will marry you. His face lit with such joy that Grace felt her heart might burst. Carefully, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands and kissed her their first true kiss, sweet and reverent and full of promise. When they parted, both breathless, Yates pressed his forehead to hers. You've made me the happiest man in the territory. We should probably tell Reverend Miller, Grace said with a small laugh, before Mrs. Thompson spreads the news for us. I'd marry you tomorrow if I could, Yates admitted, but I suppose some things are worth waiting for. They agreed on an autumn wedding, giving them time to prepare and to complete the busiest season of ranch work. News of their engagement spread quickly through Truth or Consequences, generally met with approval and well wishes. Even Olivia Thompson seemed to soften her earlier disapproval, especially after Yates made a generous donation to the church building fund. As the wedding approached, they faced the practical question of where they would live after marriage. Both had their own land, their own homes. We could alternate, Yates suggested one afternoon as they rode fence lines together. Split our time between both places. Grace considered this. That seems impractical for daily ranch operations. True, Yates acknowledged. What do you propose? Your ranch is larger, better situated for expanding the herd, Grace said thoughtfully. Logically, it makes more sense to base our operations there. But your cabin was your father's, Yates reminded her gently. I know what that means to you. Grace was touched by his understanding. It does hold memories. But perhaps we could build something new together, on your land but incorporating some elements of my cabin. The hearth stones, perhaps, or the carved door frame my father made. Yates's face lit with enthusiasm. We could start construction right away. Design it ourselves, something that reflects both of us. The idea took hold, and soon they were sketching plans in the evenings, combining Yates's practical knowledge of construction with Grace's eye for making a house feel like home. They decided on a location on Yates's property, a gentle rise overlooking the valley, sheltered by cottonwood trees, with mountains framing the view to the east. By September, the foundation was laid and the frame was rising, a tangible symbol of the future they were building together. Grace often rode over after completing her chores to watch the progress, marveling at how quickly their sketches were becoming reality. On one such visit, she found Yates carefully removing the carved door frame from her cabin to incorporate into their new home. I thought this could be the entrance to our bedroom, he explained. Your father's craftsmanship deserves to be preserved. The thoughtful gesture moved Grace deeply. He would have liked you, she told Yates, running her fingers over the intricate patterns her father had painstakingly carved. He always said to measure a man by how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. And how would I measure up? Yates asked. Grace smiled, remembering their first meeting. The man who stops to help a stranger carrying firewood in a snowstorm. I think you'd pass his test. Their wedding day dawned clear and crisp in mid-October. The aspens in the mountains turned to gold against the evergreens. The small church in Truth or Consequences was decorated with autumn wildflowers and ribbons, and it seemed the entire community had turned out for the occasion. Grace wore a new dress of ivory satin, ordered from a catalog, and altered to fit her slender frame. As she waited in the small antechamber of the church, a flutter of nerves threatened to overwhelm her. "Your father would be so proud," said Martha Jenkins, the widow who had helped Grace prepare for the ceremony. "You look beautiful, dear." "Thank you," Grace whispered, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "I just wish he could be here." "He is, in a way," Martha assured her. "In your strength, your kindness. Those didn't come from nowhere." When the church doors opened and Grace began her solitary walk down the aisle, she felt a curious sense of both endings and beginnings. She was leaving behind the solitary existence she had known, stepping into a partnership that would reshape her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. At the altar, Yates waited, his face transformed with joy when he saw her. Beside him stood Marcus Foster, one of their ranch hands who had become a trusted friend. The congregation rose as Grace approached, but she was aware only of Yates, of the love shining in his eyes as he took her hand. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Miller began, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony passed in a blur of emotion for Grace. She was acutely aware of Yates's steady presence beside her, of the weight of the simple gold band as he slipped it onto her finger, of the tremor in his voice as he recited his vows. "I, Yates Quinn, take you, Grace Gibson, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When Grace spoke her own vows, she was surprised by the steadiness of her voice, the absolute certainty she felt in her heart. This was right. This was where she belonged. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Miller announced finally, and amidst the applause of their friends and neighbors, Yates gathered Grace into his arms for a kiss that sealed their union tender but filled with promise. The celebration afterward was held at the community hall, transformed by lanterns and flowers into a festive space. There was music and dancing, a feast prepared by the women of the church, and enough goodwill to fill the room to bursting. Even the most hardened ranchers seemed touched by the obvious happiness of the newlyweds. As evening fell, Yates and Grace slipped away from the celebrations, mounting their horses for the ride to Yates's their ranch now. Though their new home wasn't yet complete, they had prepared the existing ranch house for their first weeks as husband and wife. "Mrs. Quinn," Yates said as they rode side by side under a sky ablaze with stars. "How does it sound to you?" "Unfamiliar," Grace admitted with a smile. "But I think I'll grow to like it." When they reached the ranch, Yates surprised her by swinging down from his horse and lifting her from her saddle in one fluid motion. "Tradition dictates I carry you across the threshold," he explained, his arms secure around her. "Does tradition account for how far it is from the barn to the house?" Grace teased, though she made no move to be put down. "For you," Yates said, beginning to walk, "I'd carry you to Santa Fe if necessary." Their life together began that night, a blending of two strong individuals who had each known loneliness, and now found in each other not just companionship, but true partnership. The physical aspect of their union proved to be as harmonious as their temperaments, each discovering in the other a passionate nature that had lain dormant until now. In the quiet hours before dawn, Grace lay awake, watching Yates sleep beside her. His face in repose looked younger, the lines of responsibility smoothed away. She traced the contours of his features lightly with her fingertips, marveling at the turn her life had taken since that snowy February day. "I can feel you thinking," Yates murmured without opening his eyes, capturing her hand and bringing it to his lips. "Good thoughts," Grace assured him, nestling closer. "Care to share them?" "I was just reflecting on how different my life is now than I could have imagined when you found me struggling with that firewood." Yates opened his eyes then, pulling her closer against his side. "I think I fell in love with you that day, though I didn't recognize it yet. Your determination, your pride, and then the way you looked at me when I finally convinced you to accept help, like you were measuring my worth with those green eyes of yours." "And did I find you worthy?" Grace asked, smiling. "Worthy enough to offer me coffee," Yates chuckled. "It was a start." As autumn progressed toward winter, the Quinns settled into the rhythm of married life. Their new home was completed just before the first snow, and moving Grace's belongings from her father's cabin became a celebration in itself, each item finding its place in their shared space, creating a home that honored both their pasts while looking firmly toward their future. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Yates's strength and Grace's keen eye for livestock breeding produced a herd that was becoming known throughout the territory for its quality. They added sheep the following spring, diversifying their operation at Grace's suggestion. "My father always said not to put all your eggs in one basket," she explained when presenting the idea to Yates. "Cattle prices fluctuate, but there's steady demand for wool." Yates had learned to trust his wife's business instincts, which often complemented his own more cautious approach. "If you think it's worthwhile, let's give it a try." Their personal happiness seemed to spill over into every aspect of the ranch. The bunkhouse, once a Spartan shelter for hired hands, became a gathering place for evening meals when Grace insisted on feeding their men properly. Under her influence, the ranch acquired a vegetable garden, chickens for fresh eggs, and even a milk cow luxuries Yates had never considered necessary when living alone. In the spring of 1883, as new calves and lambs dotted the pastures, Grace shared news that brought Yates to his knees beside her chair, his face a mixture of awe and trepidation. "A baby, you're certain?" Grace nodded, her own emotions similarly mixed. At 24, she was young and healthy, but childbirth in the territories was fraught with danger. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. He says I'm about 3 months along. The baby should arrive in late autumn." Yates pressed his face against her still flat stomach, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello in there, little one. Your mama and papa are very happy to know you're coming." The months of Grace's pregnancy brought changes to the ranch routine. Yates became protective, insisting on hiring additional help so Grace could reduce her physical workload. Though she protested that women have been having babies while working since the beginning of time, she secretly appreciated his concern. They converted a small room adjacent to their bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a cheerful yellow since, as Grace pointed out, "We don't know if we're getting a cowboy or a cowgirl." Yates spent his evenings crafting a cradle from pine, carving delicate patterns along the sides similar to those on the door frame Grace's father had made. By September, Grace's condition was impossible to hide, her slender frame now dominated by the prominent curve of her belly. The baby was active, especially at night, prompting Yates to speak to it sternly about letting your mama rest. "Maybe he's just eager to join us," Grace suggested one night as they lay in bed, Yates's hand splayed across her stomach to feel the acrobatics within. Yates raised an eyebrow. "You seem certain it's a boy," Grace smiled mysteriously. "Just a feeling, though I'd be equally happy with a daughter." "As would I," Yates assured her, kissing her temple, "so long as she has your spirit and your eyes." As Grace's due date approached, Yates arranged for Martha Jenkins to stay at the ranch. The widow had experience as a midwife and had assisted at most of the births in Truth or Consequences over the past decade. "First babies often take their time," Martha advised when she arrived in mid-October. But better to be prepared early than scrambling at the last minute. Her presence proved fortunate. Just 2 days after her arrival, Grace woke in the pre-dawn hours, gasping as a contraction seized her. "Yates," she whispered urgently, gripping his arm, "it's time." The next 18 hours were the longest of Yates's life. Banished from the bedroom by Martha, who insisted men were useless during childbirth, he paced the porch like a caged mountain lion, flinching at every cry that escaped through the closed windows. Marcus Foster, now their foreman, tried to distract him with ranch business, but Yates couldn't focus on cattle or fencing when Grace's life and that of their child hung in the balance. "She's strong, boss," Marcus assured him as afternoon stretched into evening with no news. "Strongest woman I ever met, excepting maybe my own mama." Yates nodded, grateful for the attempt at comfort, though his mind conjured every tragic story he'd ever heard of childbirth gone wrong. He'd known men who'd lost wives this way, left alone with newborns they could barely care for. The thought of losing Grace was unbearable. Just as dusk was falling, Martha's weathered face appeared at the door. For a heart-stopping moment, Yates couldn't read her expression, and fear clutched at his throat. Then she smiled, tired but triumphant. "You have a son, Mr. Quinn. Healthy and strong lunged, and your wife is asking for you." Yates nearly knocked the older woman over in his haste to enter the house. In the bedroom, he found Grace propped against pillows, her face pale and exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your son," she whispered as Yates approached cautiously, overwhelmed by the tableau before him. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, peering at the tiny red face partially visible among the blankets. "He's so small," Yates marveled. 8 pounds, according to Martha. "Not so small," Grace countered with a weary smile. "Would you like to hold him?" With trembling hands, Yates accepted the swaddled infant. The baby's eyes were closed, his miniature features still puffy from birth, a wisp of dark hair peeking from beneath the blanket. As Yates cradled him, the baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep blue irises that seemed to look straight through him. "Hello, son," Yates murmured, his voice breaking. "I'm your father." The infant stared at him solemnly for a moment before his face scrunched in preparation for a cry. Yates quickly passed him back to Grace, who soothed him with practiced ease. "He needs a name," she said, stroking the baby's cheek. "I thought perhaps Samuel after my father, Samuel James Quinn." "Samuel," Yates repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect, strong but not showy. Like his grandfather, from what you've told me." "And James for your father," Grace added. "So he carries both our histories with him." Yates leaned forward to kiss her gently, overcome with gratitude for this woman who had transformed his life in ways he'd never imagined possible. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for our son, for everything." Samuel James Quinn brought a new dimension to the Quinn Ranch. His arrival coincided with the first heavy snow of the season, as if nature herself had arranged to keep the new family close to home during those early weeks. Grace recovered quickly from the birth, her natural vigor reasserting itself despite Martha's admonitions to rest. By December, she was back to managing household affairs, though she delegated more of the outdoor work than before, unwilling to be separated from Samuel for long. Yates found fatherhood both terrifying and exhilarating. The complete dependency of this tiny being awakened protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. He would sit for hours watching Samuel sleep, marveling at the perfect miniature fingers, the rise and fall of his chest, the occasional smile that Grace insisted was not just gas, regardless of what Martha said. "He knows his papa," Grace maintained when Yates elicited one such smile during a diaper change. "Look how his eyes follow you." Indeed, as Samuel grew from newborn to infant, his attachment to both parents became evident. He would quiet at the sound of Yates's deep voice, watching intently when his father moved about the room. With Grace, he was most content, his small body relaxing against her in complete trust. Their first Christmas as a family was simple but meaningful. They decorated a small pine tree cut from their own land, adorned with paper ornaments Grace had crafted during Samuel's naps. Yates presented Grace with a silver locket containing a tiny daguerreotype of Samuel, taken when a traveling photographer had passed through Truth or Consequences the previous month. "Now you can keep him close to your heart even when he's not in your arms," Yates explained as he fastened the chain around her neck. Grace's gift to him was equally thoughtful, a leather-bound journal with Samuel's name and birth date embossed on the cover. "For recording his milestones," she explained, "and your thoughts as he grows. My father kept one for me, and it's one of my most treasured possessions now." That night, after Samuel was asleep in his cradle and the house was quiet save for the crackling of the fire, Yates and Grace sat together on the sofa, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the flames. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked softly. "When you bought the Fletcher place?" "This life?" Yates considered the question, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I imagined a home, cattle, maybe some success as a rancher, but this you and Samuel know, this is far beyond what I dared to hope for." Grace tilted her face up to his. "When you found me that day with the firewood, I was just trying to survive until spring. I couldn't see a future beyond the next meal, the next cord of wood. You gave me back the ability to dream, Yates. He kissed her then, slow and tender, pouring into the gesture all the love he sometimes struggled to express in words. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. We've built something good here, haven't we? Very good, Grace agreed, and we're just beginning. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. The spring cattle drive of 1884 brought the highest prices yet for their stock, allowing Yates to purchase additional acreage adjoining their property. Grace's sheep operation expanded, with the first wool clip exceeding expectations in both quantity and quality. By Samuel's second birthday in October 1885, he was a sturdy, curious boy with Yates's dark hair and Grace's green eyes. He followed his father around the ranch whenever permitted, solemnly observing the daily routines of cattle and horses from the safety of Yates's arms. "Papa cow," he would announce importantly, pointing at the herd. "That's right, son," Yates would confirm. "Those are our cattle. Someday they'll be yours to manage." Grace sometimes watched these exchanges from the porch, her heart full at the sight of her two men together, one large, one small, but unmistakably cut from the same cloth. Yates had taken to fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything he valued, his initial trepidation giving way to confidence as Samuel thrived under their care. The winter of 1885 brought another significant change to the Quinn household. As Christmas approached, Grace discovered she was expecting their second child due in midsummer. The news was received with joy, though tempered by the memory of Samuel's difficult birth. "We'll have Dr. Simmons here this time," Yates insisted. "No arguments," Grace agreed readily. At 26, she was still young and healthy, but she understood Yates's concern. Truth or consequences had grown enough to support a permanent physician now, a luxury not available when Samuel was born. As spring returned to the New Mexico landscape, bringing with it new calves and lambs, Grace's pregnancy progressed without complications. Samuel, now approaching 3, was fascinated by the changes in his mother's body. "Baby in there?" he would ask, patting her growing belly with gentle hands. "Yes, sweetheart," Grace would confirm. "Your brother or sister is growing inside just like you did." "I help," Samuel would declare firmly, his small face serious with the responsibility. By June, Grace was feeling the effects of carrying a child during the heat of summer, a stark contrast to her winter pregnancy with Samuel. Yates insisted on hiring additional household help, bringing in Rosa Martinez, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, to assist with cooking and cleaning. "You're being overprotective," Grace protested, though without much conviction. The truth was, she welcomed the help as the summer heat sapped her energy. "Indulge me," Yates requested, kissing her forehead. "Consider it a selfish desire to keep my wife happy and healthy." On a sweltering July afternoon, while Yates and the ranch hands were moving cattle to higher pastures for better grazing, Grace felt the first contractions begin. Unlike the prolonged labor with Samuel, this birth progressed rapidly, almost too rapidly. Rosa was sent running to fetch Martha Jenkins from her home at the edge of the ranch property, while Simmons was summoned from town. But the baby, impatient to join the world, didn't wait for either to arrive. With only Rosa's inexperienced assistance, Grace delivered a perfect daughter just as Martha bustled through the door, medical bag in hand. The older woman took control of the situation with practiced efficiency, checking the newborn and tending to Grace, while Rosa rode to find Yates. By the time Yates galloped into the yard, his face white with fear, his daughter was bathed, swaddled, and sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "You have a daughter," Grace announced as he burst through the bedroom door, still dusty from the range. "She couldn't wait to meet you." Yates approached the bed cautiously, his expression shifting from concern to wonder as he gazed at the tiny face peeking from the blankets. Unlike Samuel's dark coloring, this baby had a dusting of reddish hair, reminiscent of Grace's auburn tresses. "She's beautiful," he whispered, sitting carefully beside them. "Like her mother. Would you like to hold her?" Grace offered. This time, Yates accepted with more confidence, cradling the newborn with hands that had grown accustomed to the fragility of infants. The baby squirmed slightly in his arms, her tiny fists waving before her eyes blinked open, revealing the deep blue common to all newborns. "Hello, little one," Yates murmured. "You certainly know how to make an entrance, Doctor." Simmons arrived an hour later, confirming that both mother and child were healthy despite the hasty delivery. "She's a strong one," he pronounced after examining the baby. "Good weight, good color, good lungs." "We'd like to name her Elizabeth," Grace told Yates that evening as they sat together on their bed, Samuel curled up beside them, cautiously touching his sister's hand with a single finger. "Elizabeth Rose Quinn. For your mother?" Yates asked, knowing Grace had been named for her grandmother. Grace nodded. "And Rose for the day she was born, the first day the wild roses bloomed by the creek this year. I noticed them this morning before she decided to arrive." "Elizabeth Rose," Yates repeated, testing the name. "It suits her." Samuel leaned closer, his small face solemn with concentration as he studied his sister. "Baby Beth," he announced decisively. Grace and Yates exchanged amused glances. "Baby Beth it is," Grace agreed, smoothing Samuel's dark hair. "Do you like your sister?" Samuel nodded vigorously. "My sister," he confirmed, with all the certainty of a nearly 3-year-old. "I keep her safe." Yates's throat tightened at his son's pronouncement. "Yes, you will," he agreed, putting an arm around Samuel's small shoulders. "That's what big brothers do." With the arrival of Elizabeth, the Quinn family felt complete. The ranch house, once too spacious for a bachelor, now seemed perfectly sized for their growing family. The sound of children's laughter filled rooms that had previously known only the practical conversations of ranch business. As the years passed, Samuel grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy, shadowing his father in all aspects of ranch operations, absorbing knowledge like the dry earth soaked up summer rain. Elizabeth, nicknamed Beth by everyone, revealed herself to be spirited and determined, with her mother's quick intelligence and her father's quiet strength. By the time Samuel was 10 and Beth 7, the Quinn Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Yates and Grace had expanded their operation to include not just cattle and sheep, but also horses, with a small breeding program focusing on sturdy ranch mounts known for their endurance and cow sense. Truth or Consequences had grown as well, transforming from a small settlement to a proper town with a school, a bank, and even a small hotel. Grace served on the school board, while Yates occasionally acted as unofficial deputy when Sheriff Miller needed assistance. One spring evening in 1893, as the family sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment. "You remember telling me once that this land would tell us what it was best suited for?" She asked Yates, who sat beside her, his hand covering hers on the porch railing. "I recall something like that," he acknowledged with a smile. "I think it was always meant for this," Grace said, gesturing to encompass not just the prosperous ranch but also their children playing a game of tag in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "For a family, for a home." Yates's fingers tightened around hers. "You know, when I found you struggling with that firewood in the snow, I thought I was just being neighborly. I had no idea I was meeting my future." "Is that why you helped me?" Grace teased. "Hidden motives, Mr. Quinn." "The only motive was not wanting to see a stubborn woman freeze to death," Yates countered with a grin. "The falling in love part came later." "When exactly?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. They had rarely discussed the early days of their relationship in recent years, too busy with the present to dwell much on the past. Yates considered the question seriously. "I think it might have been during that blizzard, when you were mending my coat and telling me about your father's ranch in Colorado. There was such passion in your voice when you spoke about the land, about the work. I remember thinking you were the most alive person I'd ever met." Grace leaned against his shoulder, warmed by the memory. "For me, it was when you built the fire in my cabin that first day. Such a simple thing, but no one had taken care of me that way since my father died. It reminded me that I wasn't meant to be alone." From the yard, Beth's voice called them back to the present. "Mama, Papa, look what Sam found. The children approached, Samuel holding something carefully in cupped hands, Beth dancing alongside him in excitement. "It's a baby bird," Samuel explained, opening his hands just enough for his parents to glimpse the tiny creature within. "It fell from its nest. Can we keep it until it's strong enough to fly?" "Where did you find it?" Grace asked. "Under the big cottonwood by the creek," Beth supplied. "We looked for the nest, but it's too high." Yates exchanged a glance with Grace, both recognizing the teaching moment. "What do you think, Sam?" he asked. "What does a baby bird need most?" Samuel considered the question thoughtfully. "Its mother, probably, and protection." "That's right," Grace confirmed. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is find a way to return a creature to where it belongs. Like when you helped me get the firewood home," Beth piped up. Familiar with the story of how her parents met, Grace smiled at her daughter's connection. "Exactly like that. Sometimes people need help too, just for a little while until they can manage on their own again." "I'll help you build a makeshift nest," Yates offered, standing. "We can place it in the lower branches where the mother might find it." As Yates led the children toward the workshop to gather supplies, Grace remained on the porch, watching them go with a heart full of gratitude. The life they had built together, ranch, family, community, had exceeded any dreams she might have had that snowy day when a stranger stopped to lighten her burden. "Let me do this," he had said, taking the firewood from her arms. Such a simple offer, yet it had changed everything. Sometimes the greatest journeys began with the smallest steps, the most ordinary moments. The future stretched before them, as vast and promising as the New Mexico landscape itself. There would be challenges, of course, drought years and harsh winters, the normal trials of raising children, the inevitable changes that time brings. But Grace faced that future without fear, secure in the knowledge that she and Yates would weather whatever came their way, just as they had from the beginning. As twilight deepened into darkness, Grace finally rose from her seat on the porch and walked toward the workshop where her family's voices mingled with the sounds of the evening, her husband's deep tones, her son's earnest questions, her daughter's bright laughter. A perfect harmony, she thought, like the most beautiful of trail songs. This was home. This was love. This was the life that had begun with an act of kindness in the snow.